Good afternoon. Okay, today we have joining us our NEC Director, Brian Deese, who's just going to give some brief opening remarks. He'll take some questions, and then we'll do a briefing from there. Take it away.
Hello, everybody. Hello. It's good to be here today. All right. Enthusiasm, I like that. So I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes on providing some context on where we are in the economic recovery, and also use some charts, which will be really fun. The president released a statement earlier today saying that our economy, our economic recovery has two components: getting Americans back to work and getting prices and supply chains back to normal. And so I want to provide a little bit of context on our perspective on that issue. So first, today we learned that the number of Americans filing for unemployment insurance fell to its lowest level since 1969. And I will, as I think I have done every time I've come to this podium, reinforce that every time we look at data like this, 1 week, even 1 month can be volatile, so we look at the averages and trends. But if you look at the first slide here, you'll see that the trend underscores that the 4-week moving average for initial UI claims is now down by about 75% since the beginning of the year. And another way to think about that is that at the beginning of this year, there were 18 million Americans who were collecting unemployment benefits. And today, we learned that now that number has fallen to fewer than 2 million. So in addition to that consistent trend, we're also seeing a reduction in 16 million Americans who were previously relying on government benefits that have now transitioned off of it. We also learned last week that the unemployment rate fell to 4.2%, which is, again, the fastest year-to-date decline in the unemployment rate on record. And in this second chart, you see, there we are. This second chart, you see that is not only the fastest decline, but it's also very significantly accelerated from what was projected at the beginning of this year. So the I guess mauve, what color is that? That light brown line. Mauve, is that right? No, okay. Getting clear feedback from the front row that it is not mauve. The brown line, the light brown line, shows the projections from the beginning of this year prior to the passage of the American Rescue Plan, which showed that it projected to take our economy until the end of 2024 to get to an unemployment rate of about 4.2%. And now we have reached that in the fourth quarter of 2021, which underscores both the significance of the American Rescue Plan in helping drive a strong labor market recovery, but also just the benefit for the American people of reaching that point. I would just note as well, in terms of labor market strength, that we have also seen encouraging signs in labor force participation, because when the unemployment rate comes down, it can be because people are joining the labor force or coming out. And we saw that the prime age employment to population ratio, which is the metric of that economists generally look at, increased by 0.5% last month, and we've now recovered nearly 85% of our pandemic drop in that metric. So we've seen very strong labor market developments, and those labor market developments are coupled by strong developments in overall economic growth and in household income and demand. And so that puts us in a position where today real household income is higher than before the pandemic. So real household income for the typical American family is $350 a month higher now than before the pandemic in real terms, accounting for price increases, accounting for inflation. And so that strength of the labor market, that strength of household balance sheets, that strength of economic growth positions us uniquely well to deal with the challenges that we face of prices and supply chain issues. In fact, uniquely among industrialized countries, we are the only country that has seen GDP now recover from its pre-pandemic levels, has seen household income recover from its pre-pandemic levels. So that positions us uniquely well. And so on that note, we are, as you all know, very focused on addressing the issue of prices and supply chain bottlenecks head on. from that position of strength. Tomorrow we will get data on consumer prices for November, and I'm not going to attempt to predict what those data are. Outside forecasters expect those data to continue to show price increases to remain at elevated levels. But I want to provide a little bit of context on that front as well. The first is that data is by definition backward-looking, and so it won't capture some recent price movements, particularly in the area of energy. And so, for example, prices of gas at the gas pump are now down nationally. They're down about 9 cents. But to put some context on that, this next chart over here, this shows the inflation-adjusted real price of gas at the pump over the last 10 years. And what it shows is that on average, over the last 10 years, and in fact, this is true over the last 20 years, the average price at the pump for a gallon of gas has been about $3.13 in real terms, inflation adjusted. And so today, 20 states now have pump prices that are below that 20-year average. And as prices come down nationally over the next couple of weeks, as we expect and hope that they will, we hope to see more states falling into that category. Those price reductions will not be reflected in the data for November. In addition, this week we've seen natural gas prices fall. They're now down 25% from their average in November, and that is good news, particularly looking into the winter home heating season. I know several of you reported on and were focused on natural gas price increases earlier this fall, portending potentially big increases in heating costs over the winter. The very dramatic decline in natural gas prices over the course of the last couple of weeks have changed that outlook quite meaningfully. So these declines are delivering, most importantly, some benefit to consumers and some benefits to consumers on a go-forward basis that won't be reflected in that data. Secondly, we've seen some near movements on other commodity prices over the course of the last couple of weeks. We've seen shipping costs to move a container from Asia to the United States come down by about 25% over the course of the last couple of weeks. The price of wheat, the price of pork has come down, and importantly, used cars as well. I know many of you have seen and tracked in some of the recent price data that used cars have played an outsized influence. There's been challenges in the used car market, including relating to reflecting the fact that rental car companies sold off their fleets and were buying back. We anticipate that some of the recent decline in used car prices at the wholesale level indicates that we may see prices decline there as well. Again, that won't be reflected in backward-looking data from tomorrow. And lastly, the consensus estimates of outside experts continue to forecast and project that price increases will moderate going into 2022. The blue chip consensus for core PCE inflation, for example, by the fourth quarter of next year is down to 2.2%. For example. So that's, I think, important context for all of you in thinking about the data releases, but most importantly, from our perspective, it is a reason to redouble our efforts to focus on both the immediate term and the medium-term steps that we can take to try to address prices and bring down costs for families. That's what we're focused on with respect to our supply chain work, our energy price work, and of course, in moving the Build Back Better Act, which will do more than any piece of legislation in modern American history to reduce costs for families. So with that, I will open the floor.
Thank you, Jen, and Brian, thank you for being here. Jumping off right there on Build Back Better, as you anticipate and wait for this new data tomorrow, and I think there's also going to be a new cost estimate of Build Back Better requested by Republicans, how concerned is the White House that it will complicate your efforts to win over those moderate Democrats like Joe Manchin?
Well, we are quite confident that if the question is what can we do to address the costs that are most pressing to American families, that if that is the debate and that is the discussion, then the case for the Build Back Better Act is only gets stronger, and that we are building momentum around that set of arguments. If you step back and you think about a typical family's budget, and what they have to spend on expenses in a typical month, about 60% of those costs fall into housing, healthcare, prescription drugs, childcare, and transportation. That's what the bulk of a family's budget is made up of. And on each of those areas, the legislation that the president has prioritized and is moving through Congress would address and reduce those costs. And so I think that if that's the debate and that's the question, how can we address those costs that families are facing? Again, the Build Back Better Act will do more to lower costs than any piece of legislation in modern American history. And so we feel quite enthusiastic about being able to make that case.
Well, one quick follow on inflation. Fed Chair Jerome Powell said that transitory is no longer the right way to describe inflation. He said it now appears that factors pushing inflation upward will linger well into next year. Given that, do you believe that this inflation is now more entrenched and not transitory?
What we believe is that price increases elevated at the level that we're seeing hit American families in their pocketbooks, and we need to do everything that we can to address those directly. We also believe that the strength of our economic recovery, the strength of our labor market, and the strength of wage increases and the steps that we've taken to try to provide some relief to American families position our economy and American households uniquely well to address what is a global issue around price increases in the context of supply chains and otherwise.
But is Powell right? Will these increased prices last through next year?
Well, I am not going to get into the prediction business, other than to say, and I'll echo what I noted at the beginning, is that most outside independent forecasters continue to see price increases moderating meaningfully over the course of next year.
Mary? Along the same line, the president did try to set expectations in his statement today, saying you expect inflation numbers to stay high, but that doesn't reflect the reality. So when do you expect the reports will actually reflect this?
Well, I would just point to some of the real world data that we're seeing, which is that we've seen gas prices come down. We've seen natural gas prices come down. We've seen real progress in unsticking some of the supply chain bottlenecks that have persisted in our economy. I was noting on supply chains that there's actually now some reporting that the principal concern is on the back end of the holiday season, too much excess inventory, and people have overordered. And so certainly these are not these are things that don't work themselves out overnight, and I will go back to what I said at the beginning of this. We never over-index on any one piece of data or any one data release, but we're going to stay focused on what we can do to try to address these prices in the immediate term.
Thank you, Jen. Just talking about sort of gas prices coming down, Brian, a group of bipartisan lawmakers, 6 of them from Texas, as you're probably aware, sent a letter to President Biden about not reinstituting a ban on U.S. Oil exports. What is the position of the White House on that, considering the letter was sent explicitly saying that the White House is considering a move to that effect?
It's not an issue that we're currently focused on. The president, in our focus on energy markets, has made clear to the team that all options should be on the table to try to address challenges in the market and bring relief to American consumers. That's certainly the approach that we have taken to date in our international engagements, our diplomatic engagements, and actions we've taken, including the exchange and sale from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve that the president announced about 10 days ago. So we'll continue to work on those issues. We'll continue to work with states and localities to make sure that they have the support that they need, but that specific issue is not one that we're currently focused on.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up. In terms of sort of your overall, economic growth sort of forecasts from the White House, given the fact that the Omicron variant is spreading rapidly, some economists have started factoring in sort of a slowdown in demand and, for services and hiring in general. What are sort of your expectations just over the next few quarters in terms of sort of overall economic growth in the U.S.?
Well, we, like others, are obviously tracking very closely the questions raised by the Omicron variant and are waiting and watching the information as we receive it with the understanding that we need to know more, but we are learning some. We've seen some encouraging data coming out recently. But it's something that we will continue to monitor closely and study closely. In terms of the current growth, currently all indications are that the economy in the fourth quarter continues to grow robustly, and we certainly expect that to continue. And our focus is on how we can maintain the strength of the overall economic recovery, the strength of the labor market recovery, while also addressing head-on these price challenges and these supply chain bottlenecks. And to be very clear, that the risk exists that price increases become entrenched in the long term. That's something that would be a real problem for the economy. We are working in looking forward and don't see that in the current environment, but are focused on the steps that we can take to drive that kind of robust recovery going forward.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Brian. Just a quick follow-up on Build Back Better and then one on unemployment. Given how involved you are with negotiations, what is the most viable timeline right now for passing it? And is before Christmas still realistic?
So we want to move as quickly as possible, and we are working very closely with Senator Schumer and the entire caucus on facilitating that outcome. And Senator Schumer has indicated his intention, his timeline, and we're both supportive of that and believe that that's right and viable. We want to move as quickly as possible here. We think that the outstanding issues are getting worked through in the process. We're making a lot of progress. So we want to move as quickly as possible, and we believe there's every reason why we can.
And in terms of unemployment, the system now, and I think you referenced this earlier, doesn't account for gig workers and self-employed who were on unemployment insurance, but then they ran out if they were pandemic related. So is there any way you're tracking the number of those people who might not be included in the numbers but might still be struggling? And is there anything that you can do to help them?
So there's sort of two elements of that question. The first is that there were people who were previously receiving unemployment insurance are no longer receiving unemployment insurance, are obviously not reflected in the UI claims, and these reflect the people who are receiving government assistance, and that has come down dramatically, as I said, from 18 million to less than 2 million. Within that category, people who were on unemployment insurance and then come off unemployment insurance, the way to track that data is really to look at the labor force data, because those people could either be in the labor force actively looking for a job, or they could be employed, or they could end up out of the labor force. And so one of the things from an economic point of view, one of the concerns that you have is to track the labor force participation, because if people come off of unemployment but they leave the labor force entirely, then that's an outcome that you hope to avoid. So that one of the positive indications in our current labor market is that what we're seeing is, even as the number of people receiving unemployment insurance has come down dramatically, labor force participation has stayed steady and started to tick up, which suggests that people are coming back into the labor market, finding jobs in many cases, or are actively looking for jobs. But that's the sort of best proxy to get at what I think you're trying to refer to.
Thank you. Brian, some of the administration's critics have said over the last few months, as these reports come out and show inflation is rising, that the administration highlighting the bright spots like unemployment is glossing over the reality that people are paying more for food and things, basic necessities. And a lot of the people who are impacted the most are the poorest, or they're on fixed incomes. They might not be moved by an unemployment statistic. So what's your message to those people, especially getting closer to the midterms?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to be very clear, the issue of increased prices hits people in very practical ways in their lives. And no one likes to pay more at the gas pump. Nobody likes to pay more at the grocery store. And for people who are, a lower income, it can be tough. I think the message is that employment and our labor market are really important ways in which people can seek and find economic opportunity and prosperity. And the fact that wages are increasing the most for people in the bottom 40% of the income distribution is something that hasn't happened in our economy in some time, and is really positive, because what it means is that there are more job opportunities, and job opportunities at higher wages for people to move into. That's point one. Point two is that in terms of household income and their balance sheets, if you look at the bottom 25% or the bottom 40% of households, and you look at both the increase in wages that people have received and the benefits that people have received, because in the American Rescue Plan, for example, we passed a child tax credit that is now going to families on a monthly basis. We provided checks to people in there. And you look in the aggregate, household income for those people in the lower ends of the income spectrum is actually higher today on a monthly basis, even when you take into account increased inflation. So that's not true for every person, and every individual has challenges, and we want to speak to all of those. But in terms of overall, economically speaking, because of the strength of the economic recovery, the strength of the labor market, and the support that we've provided over the course of the year, people are better positioned today to deal with these challenges, which are real and which are tough, and which is why we're focused every day on what we can do to try to alleviate them.
Does the administration see inflation as a driving need to extend the child tax credit?
Our view is that the child tax credit is a really important basic support for families, and that we should extend it, and we should extend it because it's doing what we hoped it would do, which is dramatically reduce child poverty in America, dramatically reduce poverty in America, and give families some breathing room in a very strong but uncertain recovery. So certainly it's the president's position that we should do that, and we can do that. I would just underscore, we can do that as part of Build Back Better in a way that is fiscally responsible, fully paid for, won't add to any inflationary pressures in the economy.
Heather?
Yes, thanks. Brian, can you give us any timing on when the president may name additional Fed nominees? Is that process drawing to a close? Could we see something next week?
I cannot.
Josh?
You alluded to the forecast for tomorrow's number. I know you didn't want to name any, so allow me.
Great.
6.8% is our median estimate year over year. That's higher than last month, which was 6.2. The month-over-month figure is 0.7 or 0.9. So in other words, they're sort of showing different things. Year over year is getting worse, month over month getting better. My question for you is, where are we, do you think, in the arc of inflation right now? You've referenced forecast bringing it down by Q4. Do you think the wave is cresting? When you talk about backward-looking data, do you think that inflation is leveling off, the data aren't just capturing it, or do you think it's going to get worse before it gets better?
So, a couple of points. First, I'm not going to try to predict or project. Your projection is an aggregated estimate of a lot of people who've thought about this, and I'm not going to get into the projection game. We obviously do our own estimates. The second is you raise an important point. I think this is good context for in anticipation of it, which is because of what we have seen over the course of the last 12 months or 11 months, the year-over-year headline number will be elevated compared to historic levels under any circumstances. That's baked in, and that's largely a function. Well, that is 100% a function of everything that happened starting before November of this year. So in a sense, the year over year it should be taken with that context. In terms of your question about the timing, I think that we are in a place where we are seeing some of the when you look at what are the underlying issues that are driving this price pressures, we are seeing some movement that is notable. As I've spoken about on energy, with respect to the supply chains, and our focus is on tracking that across time, because we think that will be what will end up flowing through to affect those those numbers across time. This is not, I would not try to project on a week or month by month basis because these numbers move around. I mentioned used car prices, and a lot of people focus on what's happening at the wholesale markets when dealers are buying used cars, because that is really an indication of where the prices are going. But that could take a month or two to filter through into data. So in each of these cases, there are specific elements. We'll continue to look closely at them. But I think you are seeing in some important areas some movement that is notable.
Do you think the wave is cresting, or is it too soon to say?
We're going to continue to focus on what we can do to advance this recovery and advance this recovery in a way where typical households continue to have some of that breathing room, and more Americans are able to take advantage of a job market where there are historic opportunities out there.
Phil?
Thanks, Brian. Just two quick ones, if you don't mind. One of the concerns last month on the top line numbers was that perhaps it was broadening out a little bit. I'm thinking particularly not just pandemic-driven price increases, but maybe rent being one specifically. Have you guys seen anything in that side of things, not driven by the pandemic, that has raised concerns as you've looked at the data?
Well, I'm glad you raised this issue around housing and shelter prices, shelter being either rent or homes, because I think it connects to a point that Kristen, you raised, which is we have for years in this country had a problem of inadequate housing supply, of single-family homes to buy and of houses to rent. It is decades in the making of underinvestment in affordable supply, particularly in areas of the country where there is the most economic opportunity. And so it's a persistent challenge of people wanting to move to a different part of the country where they might have a job opportunity and are costed out of that because of housing. The answer to that problem is to make a historic investment in increasing the supply of affordable housing in America. That is the real answer to that question. And the sooner that we do that, the sooner that we initiate that process, the sooner that we are going to actually address that underlying challenge. And so some of the price increases that are already baked in and will flow through to those to these numbers. We know that everyone should anticipate that, but the real policy question, it goes to why Build Back Better is so important, is are we going to actually take some steps to finally address that issue so that we can say to the American people that looking forward, they can actually expect some real relief. The housing investments in the Build Back Better plan are directed exactly to that issue. How do we build the kind of housing supply that typical people need across the country in urban, suburban, and in rural areas? And so that is a real present issue, one that will continue to be with us. But hopefully, if we can get this bill done, we'll actually have the tools in place to start to show people some real progress.
And then just from a broader perspective, do you guys view it inside your team as an acceptable trade-off if prices are high for a shorter duration, a shorter period of time, perhaps because of some of the demand-driven elements of ARP, so long as you've been able to achieve some of the data, positive data you've been laying out over the course of this day, and I think the White House has been talking about for the last several months. Like this is a trade-off that's acceptable so long as those price increases don't last or become entrenched.
Well, let's start. We're humble enough to not suggest that we control all the levers of the macroeconomy, and we're in a complicated, uncertain global environment. And number one, number two, I think that our view, and I think borne out by what you're seeing internationally, is that the challenges of supply chains, of price increases, of the issues of labor supply are persistent across industrialized countries. But what's unique about the United States right now is the strength of our economic growth, the strength of our labor market, and that is in no small part due to the American Rescue Plan. So we're absolutely, not satisfied or want to accept a situation where Americans are paying high prices when they can't afford it. I think where we are in this economy is one where we have real strength, and that positions us to address real challenges that we need to.
Do a few more. April. I want to go back to the child tax credit. December 15th could be that last check if BBB is not passed. for the child tax credit. If it's not passed, what does that do to this child poverty rate that you have been touting so much, how you slashed it? Does it stay the same, or do you anticipate a rise with that?
Well, we are confident that we're going to get Build Back Better passed. Extending the child tax credit is one of many reasons why we need to do that, and we need to do that as soon as possible. And so that's why you see this administration as focused as we are on working with our congressional counterparts to move that agenda. There are multiple elements of this bill where, if you look at costs and you look at how typical household situations, the urgency is very clear. This is one. The lack of affordable housing is another. The lack of affordable childcare is another that is not a tomorrow issue for so many families that are trying to figure out how to get somebody back into the labor market. And so that's the case we're making, and we're confident we're going to get this done.
And on housing, can you talk about the price of new housing as well as existing housing? Part of the problem they're saying with housing prices, new housing prices, it deals with inflation and lumber. The cost of lumber has pushed up the price of housing and the supply chain issue. How, in the short term, do you plan to combat that as you're dealing with the housing issue and talking about affordable housing? Houses to buy right now are up because of inflation, supply chain issues.
Yeah. So it's connected to Phil's question. The prices in the residential market are elevated, but a lot of that is a supply issue. Supply issue is in part connected to near-term supply chain issues, but it is much deeper and longer term, about years and years in which we've underinvested in supply compared to the demand in the economy for housing, particularly in certain regions and geographies. The supply chain challenges that are affecting the inputs that go into home building are similar to the supply chain issues we're facing overall. But we've tried to take a dedicated focus in a number of areas. So, for example, we have an hours of service waiver for trucks that move across the country to be able to operate additional hours. We extended that to cover building materials as well. The issue of helping to move product through our ports is very important, particularly for building materials that are being imported. So we're focused on the supply chain issues in general, but as they relate to building materials wherever they can, we're trying to highlight them.
All right, let's do Kayla and Courtney, and then I'm going to wrap it up. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Jen. Thank you, Brian. My first question is on Russia. The U.S. and European allies have pledged severe harm on Russia if it escalates the situation in Ukraine. As you in the White House know, the economy is global. It is intertwined, especially the energy market, and European consumers are already paying record costs to heat their homes this winter. So I'm wondering how the administration is thinking about mitigating the impact on the U.S. economy with whatever decisions you decide to take with regard to sanctions.
So I will leave the question of sanctions and the impact on our European counterparts to Jake and to Jen. I think they've spoken to them and the sort of dynamic involved there, including as it relates to Nord Stream. With respect to U.S. consumers, the natural gas in particular is an issue that is a commodity that doesn't trade globally. And so the decline that I referenced earlier, 25% decline in natural gas prices since November, that's the price of U.S. Natural gas, which is about, I haven't looked in the last day, but 4 to 5 times lower than in Europe. And that's for a set of reasons, the export constraints. But in terms of the American consumer, looking forward to this winter, there's some positive news in terms of domestic natural gas, and not a lot of flow through to the issues you're raising.
And on wages, just to follow up domestically, I think the average American would find inflation more manageable if wages were also going up. And in the last year, inflation-adjusted weekly earnings are down 1.3%. So when can Americans expect to earn more money for the work that they're already doing?
Yeah, it's a good question and good context to connect to the earlier question as well. So, if you look at wage growth, it's important to look at it through a couple of lenses. The first is, where is that wage growth happening in the income spectrum? And what you're seeing is wage growth today that is fastest and strongest in the bottom half of the income distribution. So for working families that are making less, they're seeing their wages increase more, and in many cases significantly faster than price increases. So that's point one distributionally. The second is in terms of overall household balance sheets, the income that families have. And when you think about a family and them trying to balance their checkbook, or this year, the question is, what was my wage increase, and what was the support that I received through checks from the government, through the child tax credit. And when you take those into account and look at household income, consistent with the data that you just said, the typical family, the family at the 50th percentile, has actually seen their household income increase, even accounting for price increases. Obviously, as we move forward in this recovery, what we want to see is a strong labor market recovery. We want to see wage increases, particularly for those at the bottom, and we want to see a balancing out here of prices. That's the scenario that we're all trying to work toward.
Courtney, last one.
Can you give an update on the competition council that you're chairing? It's something I didn't hear you mention in the context of all of this.
You said it's something that's what?
Competition council. Louder. The competition council. You never mentioned it in all of this. Can you talk about some of the accomplishments of that council and what you all are working on right now?
Sure. I'm excited for the interest, and we will have. I mean that sincerely.
Settle in, everyone.
No, I mean that sincerely. And we will be convening the full council around the end of the year, and so look out for that. I can talk about some of the specifics, but I will say that actually, it's consistent with a general philosophy that does interact with a lot of the things that we were discussing here, which is that the core directive in the executive order was to pursue pro-competition policies across the federal government, across agencies, and use antitrust statutes, enforce them robustly across agencies as well. And so this intersects with a number of the issues that we've discussed. I would note positively that the House this week passed a bill on increasing competition in ocean shipping, which is something that we encouraged as part of that executive order. But more directly, you take an issue like the railroads and the lack of competition in that sector. Well, that affects this question of how do we unstick bottlenecks if there's not sufficient competition among rail lines. We talk about food prices, and I think the last time I was here, I was with Secretary Vilsack. When you look at most of the increase in food costs, you can isolate a significant portion of that to meat, beef, pork, and chicken in particular. Those are very concentrated industries where a small number of meat processors control the industry. And so what you've seen is prices for the farmers go up, prices for consumers go up, and profits for the meat processing companies in the middle go up. And that's an issue of concern, and one that we have focused on both from an antitrust perspective, but also investing in helping competitors get into that market. In fact, today we're making $500 million available to small meat processors to try to increase competition in that space. So we'd be happy to follow up and give you a full slate of where we are on there were, for those of you who were paying attention, there were 72 specific actions in that executive order. We are tracking against all of them. But I will spare the rest of you that, and we're happy to follow up.
All right. Thank you, everyone, so much. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
I definitely kept him much longer than I promised, so we want him to come back.